The moment my sister called me a failure in front of a packed courtroom, I thought my world had ended. What I didn't know was that 23 Special Forces operators were about to stand up and prove her wrong in the most dramatic way possible. This is the story of how a family torn apart by accusations and pride discovered what real honor actually looks like. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The subpoena arrived on a Thursday. I remember because I was cleaning my rifle in the barracks when Sergeant Williams knocked on my door, holding the official envelope with that look people get when they're about to deliver bad news. "Thompson, you need to see this." My father, Colonel Marcus Thompson, was being court-martialed for embezzlement. The charges were serious. Misappropriation of military funds totaling over $3 million during his deployment in Afghanistan. According to the documents, he had allegedly diverted money meant for equipment and supplies into unauthorized accounts. I stared at the papers, my hands shaking slightly. My father had been my hero since childhood. Even after I'd enlisted and seen combat myself, he remained the standard I measured myself against. The idea that he could have stolen money meant for soldiers in the field was incomprehensible. The trial was set for the following Tuesday in Denver. I requested emergency leave immediately. The flight from Fort Bragg to Denver gave me too much time to think. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from extended family, old friends who had seen the news, and fellow soldiers expressing their disbelief. But there was one person who hadn't reached out. My sister Jessica. Jessica had always lived in a different world from me. After graduating summa cum laude from Harvard Law, she'd landed a position at Morrison, Clark & Associates, one of Denver's most prestigious firms. She drove a BMW, lived in a penthouse downtown, and had married Dr. Richard Steinberg, a prominent cardiac surgeon. Everything about her life screamed success in the way society typically measures it. My path had been different. I'd struggled through high school, barely graduated, and lasted exactly one semester at community college before dropping out. At 19, with no direction and mounting debt, I walked into a recruitment office and signed my life over to the Army. Jessica had never hidden her disappointment in my choices. Family gatherings were exercises in awkward small talk where she'd ask polite questions about military life, while clearly hoping the conversation would move to something more substantial, like her latest case or Richard's recent medical conference. Presentation. The Denver courthouse was an imposing brick building downtown, surrounded by news vans and reporters. I'd worn my dress uniform, partly out of respect for my father, and partly because I wanted to look as professional as possible. The blue fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar. I rarely had occasion to wear it. Inside, the courtroom was packed. I spotted Jessica immediately in the third row, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She was sitting with Richard, both of them looking like they belonged in a magazine spread about successful couples. I took a seat in the back, hoping to avoid drawing attention. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Harrison entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. My father entered in shackles, flanked by 2 military police officers. The sight hit me like a physical blow. Colonel Marcus Thompson had commanded respect everywhere he went. He was the kind of officer who knew every soldier's name, who ate MREs in the field when his men did, who never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. Seeing him restrained and vulnerable felt fundamentally wrong. The prosecution painted a damning picture. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Morse was thorough and merciless, presenting financial records that showed large sums of money being transferred from official military accounts to offshore accounts. She detailed equipment shortages in Afghanistan that allegedly resulted from my father's theft, suggesting that soldiers had died because of his greed. During a break, I stepped outside for air. The Colorado sun was bright, but I felt cold. That's when Jessica appeared beside me, having followed me out. "What are you doing here, Derek?" Her voice carried that familiar tone of barely contained irritation. "He's our father," I said simply. "Our father is about to be convicted of stealing money that belonged to soldiers." She crossed her arms. "Soldiers like you, actually. Don't you feel even a little betrayed?" The question stung because I'd been asking myself the same thing. "I feel confused," I admitted, "but I'm not ready to abandon him based on accusations." Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Accusations? Derek, they have bank records. They have testimony from officers who reported equipment shortages. This isn't some misunderstanding. It's federal embezzlement." "Then why are you here?" I asked. "If you've already decided he's guilty, why show up?" "Because someone in this family needs to show they have standards. Someone needs to demonstrate that we don't all accept failure as normal." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You've spent your entire adult life settling for mediocrity. Community college dropout, enlisted man, living in government housing. You've never once tried to be better than ordinary." The words hit harder than I'd expected. "Military service isn't failure, Jessica. Isn't it?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're 28 years old. What do you have to show for yourself? No degree, no career prospects, no future beyond following orders until they discharge you. You're exactly what everyone expected when you dropped out. A disappointment who couldn't handle real responsibility." I felt my face burning. "I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan. You've what? Played soldier?" "Derek, Richard saves lives every day in operating rooms. I've won cases that changed policy and helped dozens of clients. We contribute to society. You just exist in it." The courthouse door opened, and people began filing back in. Jessica straightened her suit jacket and looked at me one more time. "Dad made his choices, and now he'll face the consequences. I just hope you eventually make better ones than both of you have." She walked back inside, leaving me standing alone on the courthouse steps. The afternoon heat was oppressive, but I was shivering. Everything she'd said echoed thoughts I'd had in quiet moments over the years. Was I really just hiding from real life in the military? Had I chosen service because it was easier than competing in the civilian world where Jessica thrived? When I returned to the courtroom, the prosecution was calling their final witness, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, who had served under my father in Afghanistan. Her testimony was devastating. She spoke about equipment shortages, delayed supply deliveries, and communication breakdowns that had cost lives. Colonel Thompson had access to discretionary funds that could have prevented these problems, she testified. Instead, we were forced to make do with inadequate resources while money that should have supported our mission was diverted elsewhere. Father's defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, asked a few questions during cross-examination. It was becoming clear that the evidence was overwhelming. As the day ended, I watched my father being led away. He caught my eye briefly and nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps gratitude that I was there. But Jessica's words kept echoing in my mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a failure who had never learned to face real challenges. That night, in a modest hotel near the courthouse, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more evidence of my father's alleged crimes. And I would sit there in my dress uniform, representing everything Jessica saw as inadequate and ordinary. I thought about my years of service, the missions I couldn't discuss, the friends I'd lost, the weight of responsibility I carried every day. But in the harsh light of a family crisis, all of that felt small and insignificant. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe I really was nothing more than a failure in a uniform, pretending that following orders made me somehow important. The prosecution had painted a clear picture. My father was a thief, and I was a disappointment. Tomorrow, I would discover just how wrong they both were. The second day of trial brought unexpected developments. I arrived early, determined to support my father despite Jessica's cutting words from the previous day. The media presence had grown. Overnight, more news vans, more reporters with their cameras and microphones positioned like weapons aimed at our family's destruction. Inside the courtroom, I noticed something different. There were more people in civilian clothes scattered throughout the gallery. Men with military bearing who sat quietly and watched everything with alert eyes. I didn't recognize most of them, but something about their presence felt significant. Jessica was already seated in her usual spot, this time alone. Richard had apparently decided one day of family drama was enough. She glanced back at me briefly, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention to the front of the room. Defense attorney Robert Chen looked more energetic than he had the previous day. He had a stack of new documents on his table and seemed to be consulting with someone via text message. When Judge Harrison called the court to order, Chen stood with newfound confidence. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call our first witness." What happened next caught everyone off guard, including me. The defense calls Sergeant Major James Williams. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My former platoon sergeant stood from the gallery and walked to the witness stand. Williams was a career soldier, 23 years of service, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of deployments in every major conflict since Desert Storm. I'd served under him during my second tour, and he commanded respect from everyone who knew him. After being sworn in, Chen began his questioning. "Sergeant Major Williams, how do you know the defendant, Colonel Thompson?" "I served under his command during Operation Enduring Freedom, sir. Afghanistan, 2018 to 2019. And during that time, did you have occasion to observe Colonel Thompson's leadership and decision-making?" Williams's voice was steady and clear. "Yes, sir. Colonel Thompson was the kind of commanding officer who put his soldiers first, always. He made decisions that saved lives, even when those decisions were difficult or controversial." "Can you give the court an example?" Williams looked directly at my father before answering. "There was an incident in November 2018. A convoy carrying medical supplies was attacked and pinned down in hostile territory. Standard protocol would have been to wait for air support, which could have taken hours. Colonel Thompson authorized an immediate rescue mission using resources that weren't technically available through normal channels." Chen moved closer to the witness stand. "What do you mean by resources that weren't technically available?" "He paid for additional helicopter support out of his discretionary fund, brought in contractors who weren't part of the official operation. It cost approximately $40,000 in unauthorized expenses." I felt my chest tighten. This was starting to sound like the prosecution's case: unauthorized spending, circumventing official channels. "And what was the result of this unauthorized spending, Sergeant Major?" Williams's jaw set firmly. 14 soldiers came home alive who wouldn't have otherwise, including 3 critically wounded Marines who would have died without immediate medical evacuation. The courtroom was completely silent. Chen let the weight of that statement settle before continuing. "In your opinion, Sergeant Major, was Colonel Thompson's decision appropriate?" "Sir, Colonel Thompson understood something that bureaucrats and accountants don't. Sometimes saving lives requires action that looks wrong on paper, but is absolutely right in the field." The prosecution objected, calling Williams's statement opinion rather than fact, but the damage was done. The narrative was beginning to shift. Chen continued with his examination, and Williams detailed incident after incident where my father had bent rules and spent unauthorized funds to protect his soldiers. Each story painted a picture of a commander who prioritized lives over procedures. "Sergeant Major," Chen said, "are you aware that Colonel Thompson faces charges of embezzling over $3 million? "Yes, sir, I am." In your experience serving under his command, did you ever see any evidence that Colonel Thompson was stealing money for personal gain? Williams looked incredulous. Sir, Colonel Thompson lived in the same quarters as his junior officers. He ate the same meals. He refused comfort items that were offered to senior staff. If he was stealing money, he sure wasn't spending it on himself. During cross-examination, District Attorney Morse tried to discredit Williams, suggesting that his loyalty to his former commander was clouding his judgment. But Williams was unshakable. Ma'am, I've served under dozens of officers in my career. Most of them were good soldiers. A few were great leaders. Colonel Thompson was something rarer. He was a commander who understood that rules exist to serve soldiers, not the other way around. After Williams stepped down, Chen called his second witness, and I nearly fell out of my chair. The defense calls Derek Thompson. Every head in the courtroom turned to look at me. Jessica's mouth actually fell open. I felt like I was moving through water as I walked to the front of the room, my legs unsteady beneath me. Judge Harrison administered the oath, and I swore to tell the truth, though I had no idea what truth Chen wanted me to reveal. State your name and occupation for the record, Chen began. Derek Michael Thompson. I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Army, currently stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And what is your relationship to the defendant? He's my father? Chen approached the witness stand, and I noticed he was holding a folder I hadn't seen before. Staff Sergeant Thompson, what is your military specialty? I hesitated, unsure where this was leading. I'm Special Forces qualified, sir. Green. Beret. A murmur went through the courtroom. Jessica was staring at me with a look I'd never seen before, complete shock mixed with something that might have been recognition. And how long have you held that qualification? 4 years, sir. Chen opened his folder and pulled out a document. Staff Sergeant Thompson, are you familiar with Operation Silent Guardian? My blood ran cold. Silent Guardian was classified. I couldn't discuss details of that mission in open court. Sir, I can't. Your Honor, Chen interrupted. I have here a declassification order signed yesterday by the Secretary of Defense, specifically authorizing discussion of Operation Silent Guardian for the purposes of this trial. He handed the case document to Judge Harrison, who reviewed it carefully before nodding. You may proceed, Counselor. Chen turned back to me. Staff Sergeant Thompson, what was Operation Silent Guardian? I took a deep breath, still trying to process what was happening. It was a humanitarian assistance mission in Afghanistan, conducted in March 2019. My team was tasked with securing supply routes in Kandahar province to ensure medical aid could reach remote villages. How many soldiers were under your command during this operation? 12, sir. All special forces qualified. And what happened during the mission? The memories came flooding back, memories I'd tried to bury. We were cut off. Insurgents destroyed our primary and backup communication equipment. We were trapped in hostile territory for 6 days with limited supplies and no way to call for extraction. How did you and your team survive? Emergency supply drops, medical supplies, additional ammunition. Someone was coordinating support for us even though we couldn't communicate our position through normal channels. Chen pulled out another document. Staff Sergeant Thompson, according to this after-action report, your team's survival depended on supply drops that cost approximately $200,000 in unauthorized funds. Were you aware of this? I stared at the document, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. No, sir. We were told it was standard emergency protocol. The report also indicates that these supply drops were personally authorized by Colonel Marcus Thompson, using his discretionary fund and taking full responsibility for the unauthorized expenditure. The courtroom was dead silent. I felt like the world had shifted beneath my feet. Staff Sergeant Thompson, did you and your 12-man team make it home safely? Yes, sir. All of you? Yes, sir. Chen walked back to his table and picked up one. More document, this one in a blue folder with military seals. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the citation for Staff Sergeant Thompson's Silver Star, awarded for exceptional valor during Operation Silent Guardian. Jessica actually gasped audibly from the gallery. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and confusion. The Silver Star was something I'd never discussed with my family. It felt too personal, too connected to friends I'd lost and decisions I'd made that still haunted me. Chen read the citation aloud. For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States while serving as team leader during Operation Silent Guardian. Staff Sergeant Thompson's exceptional courage under fire and decisive leadership under extreme conditions resulted in the successful completion of the mission and the safe return of all personnel under his command. The attorney set the citation down and looked directly at me. Staff Sergeant Thompson, your father is accused of stealing $3 million. Based on your knowledge of his character and your personal experience with his decision-making, do you believe these charges are accurate? I looked across the courtroom at my father, who was watching me with pride and something that might have been hope. Then I looked at Jessica, whose entire worldview seemed to be crumbling in real time. No, sir, I said firmly. I believe my father spent that money saving soldiers' lives, including mine. The weight of that realization settled over the courtroom, like a heavy blanket. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I caught Jessica's eye. For the first time in years, she was looking at me like she was seeing someone she'd never met before. The defense was just getting started, but already the prosecution's case was looking less certain. My father wasn't a thief. He was a commander who had risked his career and freedom to bring his soldiers home alive. And apparently, I wasn't the failure Jessica had always believed me to be. The lunch recess felt like it lasted forever. I sat, alone in the courthouse cafeteria, picking at a sandwich I couldn't taste, trying to process what had just happened. My testimony had clearly shaken Jessica, but I wasn't sure if that was good or bad. The revelation about my Silver Star had been as much a surprise to me as anyone else. I'd never expected it to become part of my father's defense. When court resumed, defense attorney Chen called his next witness, Captain Maria Rodriguez, who had served as my father's intelligence officer in Afghanistan. Rodriguez was sharp, professional, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. Captain Rodriguez, Chen began, during your deployment with Colonel Thompson, were you aware of his financial decisions regarding mission support? I was aware of some of them, yes, sir. Colonel Thompson often consulted with me when unconventional funding was required for time-sensitive operations. Chen pulled out a thick manila folder. Can you explain to the court what you mean by unconventional funding? Rodriguez glanced at the judge before answering. In theater, situations arise that don't fit standard procurement procedures. A village might need immediate medical supplies to prevent an epidemic. Intelligence might require hiring local assets on short notice. Equipment might fail and need emergency replacement that can't wait for normal supply chains. And how were these situations typically handled? Under normal circumstances, requests would go through multiple approval levels, which could take weeks or months. By then, people would be dead, intelligence opportunities would be lost, or tactical advantages would disappear. Chen nodded. So what did Colonel Thompson do in these situations? He used his discretionary authority to fund immediate solutions. He took personal responsibility for every dollar spent and documented everything meticulously. The prosecutor, District Attorney Morse, objected that this was speculation, but Judge Harrison allowed Rodriguez to continue. Captain, do you have personal knowledge of specific instances where Colonel Thompson used these discretionary funds? Rodriguez straightened in her chair. Yes, sir. In August 2019, we received intelligence about a planned attack on a refugee camp housing approximately 300 civilians, including children. Standard procedure would have been to report the intelligence up the chain and wait for authorization to act. What did Colonel Thompson do? He authorized an immediate intervention. He hired local contractors, arranged for emergency evacuations, and provided security for the camp until regular forces could arrive. The entire operation cost approximately $80,000 in unauthorized expenses. And what was the outcome? Rodriguez's voice became quieter but more intense. 300 innocent people lived to see their children grow up. The attack came exactly as predicted, but the camp was empty except for our security team. Chen Di walked closer to the witness stand. Captain Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, was Colonel Thompson's decision appropriate? Sir, it was the only decision that could have been made by a commander who valued human life over bureaucratic procedures. During cross-examination, Morse tried to establish that these actions, however well-intentioned, still constituted misappropriation of funds. But Rodriguez held firm. Ma'am, respectfully, saving lives isn't misappropriation, it's leadership. As Rodriguez stepped down, I noticed more movement in the gallery. Additional men in civilian clothes had entered during her testimony, sitting quietly but attentively. There was something about their bearing that made me think they might be military, though I couldn't be sure. Chen called his next witness, Master Sergeant Timothy Chen, no relation to the defense attorney, who had been responsible for logistics during my father's command. Chen's testimony focused on the detailed records my father had kept of every expenditure, showing that while the spending was unauthorized, it was meticulously documented and justified. Master Sergeant Chen, the attorney asked, did Colonel Thompson ever attempt to hide these expenditures? No, sir. Every dollar was recorded with detailed explanations of the operational necessity. Colonel Thompson maintained complete transparency with his staff about these decisions. In your experience, is this typical behavior for someone embezzling funds? Morse objected again, but the point was made. Embezzlers don't typically document their crimes in official military records. The afternoon brought what would prove to be the most dramatic testimony of the trial. Chen called Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a civilian contractor who had worked with military medical units in Afghanistan. Dr. Mitchell, Chen began, did you have occasion to work with units under Colonel Thompson's command? I did. I was part of a medical team providing humanitarian assistance in remote areas of Kandahar province. And during that time, did you witness any of Colonel Thompson's funding decisions? Dr. Mitchell nodded emphatically. Colonel Thompson single-handedly prevented a cholera outbreak that could have killed hundreds of people. When our medical supplies were delayed due to bureaucratic complications, he personally funded an emergency airlift of antibiotics and water purification equipment. How much did this cost? Approximately $150,000. Money that officially wasn't available for that purpose. And what would have happened without his intervention? Dr. Mitchell's voice broke slightly. Children would have died. I've seen cholera outbreaks before. They spread fast and kill indiscriminately. Colonel Thompson's decision saved an entire village. Chen then did something unexpected. He asked Dr. Mitchell to identify someone in the courtroom. Dr. Mitchell, do you see anyone present today who was personally affected by Colonel Thompson's decision to fund that medical intervention? She looked around the courtroom and pointed to a young man sitting in the back, one of the civilians I'd noticed earlier. That's Corporal Jackson. He was part of the security detail for our medical team. He contracted cholera despite our precautions, but survived because Colonel Thompson's emergency funding included medical evacuation capabilities we wouldn't have had otherwise. The young man she'd pointed to nodded silently. The impact on the jury was visible. This wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet anymore. These were real people whose lives had been saved by my father's decisions. Chen's final witness of the day was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had been responsible for conducting the preliminary investigation into my father's finances. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Chen asked, what did your initial investigation reveal about Colonel Thompson's spending patterns? Hayes consulted her notes carefully. The investigation showed a consistent pattern of unauthorized expenditures. totaling approximately $3.2 million over an 18-month period. And what was your initial conclusion? Based purely on the financial records, it appeared to be a clear case of embezzlement. Chen paused dramatically. But did your investigation continue beyond the initial financial review? Yes, sir. As we dug deeper, we began to cross-reference the expenditures with operational reports, casualty figures, and mission outcomes. And what did you discover? Hayes looked directly at my father before answering. We discovered that every dollar Colonel Thompson spent correlated with either a life-saving intervention, a successful mission outcome, or the prevention of casualties that would have otherwise occurred. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, based on your complete investigation, do you believe Colonel Thompson was embezzling funds? Hayes straightened her shoulders. Sir, I believe Colonel Thompson was doing what every commander should do, putting the lives of his soldiers and innocent civilians above administrative convenience. Morse's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. The damage was done. The military's own investigator had essentially exonerated my father. As the court adjourned for the day, I watched my father being escorted out. He looked tired but hopeful for the first time since the trial began. The evidence was clearly mounting in his favor. But what struck me most was the change in Jessica. She approached me as I was leaving the courtroom, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like uncertainty. Derek, she said quietly, I need to ask you something. What? The Silver Star. When did you receive it? 2 years ago. The ceremony was at Fort Bragg. She looked down at her hands. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you invite your family to the ceremony? I studied her face, seeing something I'd never seen before. Genuine regret. Would you have come? The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. I don't know, she admitted. But I should have had the chance to make that choice. As we walked out of the courthouse together, I realized that the trial was revealing truths about more than just my father's innocence. It was exposing the assumptions and prejudices that had shaped our family for years. Tomorrow would bring the prosecution's rebuttal and possibly the jury's verdict. But tonight, for the first time in years, Jessica and I were walking in the same direction. The truth about my father was becoming clear, but the truth about who we were as a family was just beginning to emerge. The third day of trial brought an energy I hadn't felt before. Walking into the courthouse, I noticed the civilian observers from previous days had multiplied. What had been a handful of quiet men in business attire had grown to nearly 24, all carrying themselves with unmistakable military bearing. They filled an entire section of the gallery, sitting in formation-like rows. Jessica was already in her seat, but this time she turned when I entered and gave me a small nod. Not quite a smile, but acknowledgement. Progress. Defense attorney Chen appeared confident as he prepared his final witness. The prosecution had tried to recover during their rebuttal, bringing in auditors and regulations experts to argue that good intentions didn't excuse violations of military financial protocols. But their technical arguments felt hollow after the parade of lives saved testimony from the previous day. Your Honor, Chen announced, the defense calls Colonel Marcus Thompson. The moment my father stood to take the witness stand, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the civilian observers throughout the courtroom began to stand as well. It started with the man in the front row, a distinguished-looking gentleman with salt and pepper hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Then, the man beside him stood, then another, until the entire section was on their feet in silent tribute. Judge Harrison looked confused. Gentlemen, please take your seats. The first man to stand cleared his throat. Your Honor, with respect, we are former soldiers who served under Colonel Thompson's command. We're honoring our commanding officer. I understand the sentiment, but this is a courtroom, not a parade ground. Yes, ma'am. The men sat down, but the impact was unmistakable. The jury had seen something they wouldn't forget. My father took the oath with steady hands and a clear voice. Despite everything he'd been through, he still looked like a commander. Chen began with basic questions: service record, deployments, command philosophy. My father's answers were precise and professional, painting a picture of a career soldier who had dedicated his life to service. "Colonel Thompson," Chen said, "you've heard testimony about your financial decisions during your deployment in Afghanistan. Do you deny making unauthorized expenditures?" "No, I don't deny it." "Do you deny that these expenditures totaled over $3 million? "No." Chen paused, letting the admission settle. "Colonel Thompson, why did you make these expenditures?" My father looked directly at the jury. "Because saving lives was more important than following procedures that would have let people die while we waited for approval." "Can you give the court a specific example?" "Operation Silent Guardian." My father's eyes found mine across the courtroom. My son and 11 other soldiers were cut off in enemy territory with no communication and dwindling supplies. Standard extraction procedures would have taken 72 hours minimum. They had maybe 36 hours of supplies left. Chen approached the witness stand. "What did you do?" "I authorized immediate helicopter support, emergency supply drops, and hired local contractors to provide intelligence on enemy positions. It cost $200,000 that I didn't have authorization to spend." "And if you hadn't taken those actions?" My father's voice remained steady, but I could see the emotion beneath. 12 soldiers would have died, including my son. I made the choice that any father and any commanding officer would make. I brought my boys home. The courtroom was completely silent. Even District Attorney Morse seemed affected by the testimony. Chen continued questioning my father about other incidents, each one revealing a pattern of decisions that prioritized human life over administrative convenience. The school that received emergency medical supplies during a meningitis outbreak. The village that got water purification equipment during a drought. The refugee camp that received security during a terrorist threat. During cross-examination, Morse tried to establish that good intentions didn't justify breaking the rules, but my father's responses were unshakable. "Ma'am, I took an oath to protect and defend. Sometimes that requires choices that look wrong on paper but are absolutely right in the field. I'd make every one of those decisions again." As my father returned to his seat, something unprecedented happened. The man who had stood first during my father's entrance, the one with the salt and pepper hair, rose again and began walking toward the front of the courtroom. Judge Harrison looked alarmed. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately." The man stopped and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor, my name is General Robert Martinez, United States Army, retired. I served with Colonel Thompson in Iraq and Afghanistan across multiple deployments." The courtroom buzzed with recognition. Martinez was a decorated combat veteran whose name appeared regularly in military publications. Judge Harrison looked uncertain about how to handle this unprecedented situation. "General Martinez, while I respect your service, this is not the proper forum for—" "Your Honor," Martinez interrupted respectfully, "these proceedings concern an officer who served under my command, and whose character I can personally attest to. If the court is interested in Colonel Thompson's fitness as a leader, I respectfully request the opportunity to provide relevant testimony." Chen quickly stood. "Your Honor, the defense would be happy to recall General Martinez as a witness." "Judge," Harrison conferred briefly with the court clerk before ruling. "Very well. General Martinez, please approach the witness stand." As Martinez was sworn in, I noticed that several other men in the gallery were watching intently, as if waiting for their own moment to act. "General Martinez," Chen began, "what is your assessment of Colonel Thompson as an officer?" Martinez sat up straighter. "Colonel Thompson is the finest combat leader I've ever served with. He's the kind of officer who leads from the front, makes the hard decisions, and never asks his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Are you aware of the charges he faces? I am. And frankly, they're an insult to everything this man has sacrificed in service to his country. Morse objected that this was opinion testimony, but Judge Harrison allowed it to continue. General Martinez, do you believe Colonel Thompson is guilty of embezzlement? Martinez looked directly at the jury. I believe Colonel Thompson is guilty of caring more about soldiers' lives than his own career. If that's a crime, then every good officer I've ever known should be in prison. Chen asked about specific incidents Martinez had witnessed, and the general provided detailed accounts of my father's leadership under fire, his concern for his soldiers' welfare, and his willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for the good of his command. During Morse's cross-examination, she tried to establish that personal loyalty was clouding Martinez's judgment. General Martinez, isn't it true that your positive opinion of Colonel Thompson is based on friendship rather than objective assessment? Martinez's response was sharp. Ma'am, I've commanded thousands of soldiers over a 30-year career. Don't confuse friendship with professional competence. Colonel Thompson earned my respect through his actions, not through personal relationships. As Martinez concluded his testimony, another man stood in the gallery. This one was younger, maybe early 30s, with the lean build of someone who stayed in fighting shape. Your Honor, he said, Captain David Chen, Special Forces, currently serving. I was part of the unit that benefited from Colonel Thompson's decision during Operation Silent Guardian. Judge Harrison looked exasperated, but seemed to realize that attempting to maintain normal courtroom decorum was futile. Captain Chen, do you have relevant testimony regarding the defendant? Yes, ma'am. Colonel Thompson's unauthorized expenditure saved my life and the lives of my teammates. I'd like the opportunity to tell the court exactly what his leadership meant to those of us who served under him. What followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in a courtroom. One by one, soldiers who had served under my father's command requested permission to testify. Judge Harrison, clearly overwhelmed by the unprecedented situation, established a procedure allowing brief statements from each man. Captain Chen spoke about the helicopter extraction during Operation Silent Guardian. Sergeant First Class Williams testified about the medical supplies that prevented a cholera epidemic. Master Sergeant Rodriguez described the security operation that saved a refugee camp. Each testimony was brief but powerful, painting a picture of a commander who consistently put his soldiers' lives above his own career interests. By the time the impromptu testimonials concluded, 23 current and former soldiers had spoken on my father's behalf. The impact on the jury was visible. Several members were visibly moved, and even the alternates seemed affected by what they'd heard. Jessica had watched the entire proceedings with growing amazement. When the court recessed for deliberation, she approached me with tears in her eyes. Derek, I had no idea. All these years I thought Dad was just another middle management military officer. I never realized he was this. None of us talk about it much, I said. It's not something you brag about. It's just what you do. She wiped her eyes carefully, mindful of her makeup. And you, the Silver Star, Special Forces, leading men in combat. I've been such a fool. You weren't a fool, Jessica. You just didn't know what questions to ask. As we waited for the jury's verdict, surrounded by 24 soldiers who had traveled from across the country to support their colonel, I realized that something fundamental had changed in our family. The trial had revealed not just my father's innocence, but the depth of respect and loyalty he had earned through decades of service. Whatever the verdict, these men had already delivered their own judgment. In their eyes, Colonel Marcus Thompson wasn't a criminal. He was exactly the kind of leader they would follow anywhere. The jury had been deliberating for 3 hours when the bailiff announced they had reached a verdict. As we filed back into the courtroom, I caught my father's eye and saw something I hadn't seen in months. Hope. The jury filed back into the courtroom with expressions that revealed nothing. I studied each face, searching for any hint of what they had decided during Their 3-hour deliberation. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, carried the verdict envelope with steady hands. The 23 soldiers who had testified remained in the gallery, sitting at attention despite being in civilian clothes. Their presence had transformed what should have been a routine court proceeding into something that felt more like a military tribunal, where honor and service were on trial alongside my father. Judge Harrison received the envelope and examined its contents before handing it back to the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor. In the matter of the United States versus Colonel Marcus Thompson, on the charge of embezzlement of government funds, how do you find?" The pause seemed to last forever. I held my breath, aware of Jessica gripping the edge of her seat beside me. "Not guilty." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. Several of the soldiers broke into spontaneous applause before catching themselves and returning to respectful silence. My father closed his eyes and lowered his head, finally allowing the stress of months to show on his face. Judge Harrison continued with the remaining charges: misappropriation of funds, violation of military financial regulations, conduct unbecoming. An officer. One by one, the foreman delivered the same verdict: not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. When the final verdict was read, the entire gallery of soldiers stood in unison, not in celebration, but in a silent salute to their vindicated colonel. Even Judge Harrison seemed moved by the display, allowing the moment to continue longer than courtroom protocol typically permitted. District Attorney Morse gathered her papers with visible frustration, but even she seemed to understand that prosecuting a man for saving lives had been a losing proposition from the start. The evidence had been overwhelming, not of guilt, but of a commander who had consistently chosen human life over bureaucratic convenience. As my father was formally released from custody, the soldiers filed out of the courtroom in an orderly procession. Each one stopped to shake his hand, exchange a few quiet words, or simply offer a respectful nod. These men had taken time off work, traveled across the country, and risked their own careers by speaking out in a military court proceeding. Their loyalty spoke volumes about the kind of leader my father had been. Outside the courthouse, the media circus was waiting. Reporters thrust microphones toward my father, shouting questions about his vindication and what he planned to do next. But before he could respond, General Martinez stepped forward and addressed the crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Colonel Thompson has served his country with distinction for over 25 years, Martinez said firmly. "Today's verdict confirms what every soldier who served under his command already knew, that he is a leader of exceptional character who put the lives of his soldiers above his own career advancement. No further questions." The general's intervention allowed my father to escape the media scrum and join Jessica and me in a quiet corner of the courthouse steps. For the first time in months, we stood together as a family without the shadow of criminal charges hanging over us. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "Dad, I owe you an apology. I let the charges make me doubt everything I thought I knew about you." My father shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. The evidence looked bad, and you reacted like any reasonable person would." "No," she insisted. "I should have known better. I should have trusted who you are instead of what the prosecutors claimed you were." She turned to me, her eyes red with unshed tears. "And Derek, I owe you an even bigger apology. I've spent years looking down on your service, thinking you were avoiding real responsibility. I had no idea what real responsibility actually looked like." The weight of her words settled between us. This was the conversation we'd needed to have for years, but it had taken a crisis to bring us to this point. "I never tried to explain it," I said. "Military life is hard to understand if you haven't lived it. The brotherhood, the sacrifices, the weight of decisions that affect other people's lives. It's not something you can easily describe to civilians." Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes carefully. The Silver Star. Tell me about it. I want to understand what I missed. So I told her, not the sanitized version that appears in official citations, but the real story. The fear, the impossible decisions, the weight of responsibility for 12 lives in hostile territory. I explained how leadership in combat isn't about giving orders from safety. It's about making choices when there are no good options and living with the consequences. The night we were cut off, I said, I had to decide whether to attempt a dangerous extraction of a wounded teammate or wait for support that might never come. I chose to act, and it saved his life, but put the rest of the team at greater risk. Those are the kinds of decisions Dad made every day as a commander, except his affected hundreds of soldiers instead of just 12. My father listened quietly, pride evident in his expression. Son, leadership isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about making necessary ones and accepting responsibility for the outcomes. You learned that lesson well. The conversation continued as we walked to a nearby restaurant, away from the media attention. For the first time in years, we talked as adults rather than as children seeking parental approval or siblings competing for attention. Jessica asked detailed questions about military culture, deployment experiences, and the bonds formed between soldiers in combat zones. I always thought success meant corner offices and six-figure salaries, she admitted over dinner. I measured worth by external markers, education, income, social status. I never considered that some people measure success by lives saved and promises kept. Different doesn't mean wrong, my father said gently. Your success in law is real and valuable. Society needs people like you just as much as it needs people like Derek. The mistake was in thinking one path is inherently better than another. Jessica reached across the table and took my hand. I want to do better. I want to understand this world that's been so important to both of you. Maybe you could help me with that. The gesture was small but significant. We'd spent so many years talking past each other that this moment of genuine connection felt profound. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Jessica threw herself into understanding military culture with the same intensity she brought to her legal cases. She read books about military history, watched documentaries about modern warfare, and even attended a veterans support group meeting to better understand the challenges faced by returning soldiers. More importantly, she began using her legal skills to help veterans navigate the complex bureaucracy of benefits claims and disability assessments. Her firm had always encouraged pro bono work, but she'd typically focused on high-profile cases that enhanced her reputation. Now she was working with former soldiers who couldn't afford legal representation but desperately needed someone to fight for them. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done, she told me during one of our regular phone calls. These men and women sacrificed so much for their country, and then they come home to bureaucratic nightmares when they need help. It's unconscionable. My father returned to active duty with his record cleared and his reputation enhanced. The Army, recognizing that the trial had actually highlighted exemplary leadership rather than criminal behavior, fast-tracked his promotion to Brigadier General. His first assignment was developing new protocols for emergency funding in combat zones, ensuring that future commanders wouldn't face prosecution for making the same life-saving decisions he had made. 6 months after the trial, Jessica called with unexpected news. She had been offered a position with a veterans advocacy organization, leading their legal department. The salary was significantly less than her current firm offered, but the opportunity to make a real difference was irresistible. I keep thinking about those soldiers who stood up in the courtroom, she said. They didn't know Dad personally, but they understood what kind of leader he was just from his actions. I want to be worthy of that kind of respect. The trial had ended with my father's vindication, but its real impact was the transformation of our family. We'd discovered that true failure isn't dropping out of college or choosing an unconventional path. It's failing to recognize courage and integrity when they're standing right in front of you. Jessica had learned that success isn't just about personal achievement, but about service to something larger than yourself. I'd learned that family bonds can survive misunderstanding and even contempt if they're built on genuine love and respect. And my father had learned that the loyalty he'd earned through decades of service would protect him when he needed it most. The 23 soldiers who stood in that courtroom had delivered their own verdict long before the jury deliberated. In their eyes, Colonel Marcus Thompson had always been exactly what a leader should be. The trial was over, but the real victory was just beginning. The victory of a family that had finally learned to see each other clearly. 1 year later, I stood in the same courthouse where my family had nearly fallen apart, but this time for a very different reason. Jessica was receiving an award from the Colorado Bar Association for her pro bono work with veterans, and she had specifically requested that my father and I be there to witness it. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The building that had once threatened to destroy our family had become the place where we celebrated Jessica's transformation into an advocate for the very community she had once misunderstood. The recipient of this year's Distinguished Service Award, announced the Bar Association president, has provided over 800 hours of free legal assistance to veterans, resulting in millions of dollars in rightfully claimed benefits and successful appeals of wrongful discharge cases. As Jessica walked to the podium to accept her award, I noticed something that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. She was wearing a small American flag pin on her lapel, not as a political statement, but as a symbol of respect for the community she now served. Her acceptance speech was brief but powerful. A year ago, I thought I understood what justice meant. I thought it was about winning cases and advancing careers. But true justice is about ensuring that those who sacrifice for others receive the protection and support they've earned. The veterans I represent have taught me more about honor and integrity than all my years of legal education combined. After the ceremony, we gathered at the same restaurant where we'd had our first real conversation as adults following the trial. The atmosphere was completely different now, relaxed, warm, filled with the easy conversation of people who genuinely understood and respected each other. "I have some news," my father announced as we settled into our seats. "I've been asked to testify before Congress about reforming military financial protocols. They want to create new procedures that allow field commanders more flexibility in emergency situations while maintaining proper oversight." The request made perfect sense. My father's case had exposed serious flaws in military bureaucracy that could cost lives in critical situations. His experience, both the unauthorized spending and the subsequent vindication, made him uniquely qualified to help develop better systems. "They're calling it the Thompson Protocol," he continued with a slight smile. "Emergency authorization procedures for combat commanders who need to act quickly to save lives." Jessica leaned forward with interest. "Will this prevent other commanders from facing what you went through?" "That's the goal. The idea is to create a formal process for retroactive approval of emergency expenditures, provided they meet specific criteria related to life-saving missions or critical operational needs." I felt a surge of pride knowing that my father's ordeal would result in positive changes that could benefit countless future soldiers and commanders. His willingness to risk his career for his soldiers' lives was being transformed into official policy that would protect both lives and careers. "There's something else," Jessica added, a hint of excitement in her voice. "The Veterans Advocacy Organization I'm working with has been invited to participate in the congressional hearings. They want legal perspectives on how these policies will affect service members who might face similar situations." The convergence was remarkable. Both my father and sister would be working together, in different capacities, to ensure that future military leaders wouldn't have to choose between following regulations and saving lives. As dinner progressed, Jessica shared stories from her recent cases: a former Marine who had been denied disability benefits despite obvious PTSD symptoms, a female Army veteran whose sexual assault claims had been dismissed through bureaucratic delays, a Navy corpsman whose heroic actions had been overshadowed by technical violations of medical protocols. Each case teaches me something new about the gap between how civilians perceive military service and what it actually entails, she said. The complexity, the moral weight of decisions, the long-term impact on people's lives, it's so much more than I ever realized. My father nodded thoughtfully. That's one of the challenges of military service. The most important work often happens in situations that can't be easily explained to people who haven't experienced them. Derek learned that early in his career. Speaking of which, Jessica turned to me. I have a proposition for you. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of proposition? The organization I work for is expanding their outreach programs. They need someone who can bridge the gap between current service members and veterans who are struggling with civilian life. Someone who understands both worlds and can speak credibly to both communities. The offer caught me off guard. You're asking me to leave active duty? I'm asking you to consider whether your skills might have an even greater impact in the civilian sector. You've proven yourself as a soldier. Maybe it's time to prove yourself as an advocate. It was an intriguing idea, but one that required serious consideration. Military service had defined my adult life, and the thought of leaving it felt both exciting and terrifying. Think about it, Jessica continued. You could help design programs that actually work because you understand what service members really need, not what civilians think they need. Over the following months, I did think about it. I researched the organization, spoke with veterans who had transitioned to civilian advocacy roles, and considered what kind of impact I might have outside the military structure. The decision became clearer when I received an unexpected call from Captain Rodriguez, one of the soldiers who had testified at my father's trial. He was struggling with his transition out of the Army and facing a maze of bureaucratic obstacles in accessing mental health services. Thompson, he said, I can handle combat zones, but I can't figure out how to get the VA to approve treatment for injuries they acknowledge I sustained in service. The system is broken, and I don't know how to fix it. That conversation convinced me. Rodriguez was a capable, intelligent leader who had excelled in complex military operations, but he was defeated by civilian bureaucracy designed to help him. If he was struggling, how many other veterans were facing similar challenges without anyone to advocate for them? 6 months later, I submitted my resignation from active duty and accepted the position with Jessica's organization. My father attended my final military ceremony, where I was awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptional service. As he pinned the medal to my uniform for the last time, he whispered, I'm proud of the soldier you've been, and I'm excited to see the civilian you'll become. The transition wasn't easy. Civilian work schedules, office politics, and funding challenges were all foreign concepts to someone accustomed to military efficiency and clear command structures. But the mission was meaningful, and the impact was immediate. Within my first year, our advocacy programs helped over 200 veterans successfully navigate benefit claims, secure appropriate medical care, and transition into meaningful civilian employment. More importantly, we developed new training programs that helped military units better prepare soldiers for civilian life before they separated from service. Jessica and I found ourselves working together regularly, combining legal expertise with operational understanding to develop comprehensive solutions for veteran issues. Our different backgrounds, which had once been a source of conflict, became complementary strengths in addressing complex problems. The Thompson Protocol was officially adopted by the Department of Defense 18 months after my father's trial. The new procedures had already been used successfully in 3 emergency situations, allowing field commanders to save lives without risking their careers. At the official signing ceremony, my father was recognized not just as the inspiration for the new policy, but as a continuing advocate for military personnel facing similar challenges. His willingness to risk everything for his soldiers had been transformed into systematic change that would protect both current and future service members. Looking back on that day in the courthouse when Jessica called me a failure, I realized that she had been right about one thing. I was failing. I was failing to communicate who I really was, failing to bridge the gap between military and civilian perspectives, and failing to use my experiences to help others. But sometimes failure is just the first step toward finding your real purpose. The trial had revealed truths about all of us that we hadn't been able to see before. It showed Jessica that success isn't just about personal achievement, taught me that service extends beyond military uniforms, and reminded my father that the loyalty he had earned through decades of leadership would endure long after his retirement. 23 soldiers who stood in that courtroom had delivered more than testimony. They had delivered a lesson about what real honor looks like. Not the kind that comes from awards or recognition, but the kind that comes from consistently choosing what's right over what's easy, and from measuring success by the lives you've touched rather than the accolades you've received. Our family had learned that true failure isn't about choosing different paths or making unconventional decisions. True failure is failing to recognize courage when it's standing right in front of you, and failing to understand that honor comes in many forms, sometimes in a courtroom, sometimes in a combat zone, and sometimes in the quiet work of helping. Others find their way home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.